Hello, I'm David Bynes, the founder and CEO of Bynes and Associates Consulting Group. And it's a pleasure to be sharing this platform, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share with the community. I want to thank Mr. Brian Knowles for the opportunity to share upon this platform and for calling upon me to participate in this 27th annual African American, and Caribbean Studies Summer Institute for the School District of Palm Beach County. So I want to share with you from this idea of bringing out Black boy joy, utilizing radical care to achieve Black male success. And so as I began to think about the theme for this year, Marathon Toward Educational Transformation, Reimagining Education by Affirming and Centering Black History and Culture. It's a lot to take in, and I realize that. So I wanted to spend a moment right there, as I think there's some key words that we have to begin to understand considering the climate that we're actually in. And so this idea of educational transformation, the idea of educational reformation, has been talked about quite a while. And so we began to talk about this idea of reimagining education, right? And some people are actually talking about, is it time now for educational abolition, right? And so there are some folks that are part of this abolitionist movement, and they're beginning to look at how do we recenter, right, things in terms of our own history. How do we recenter and remove certain historical narratives and begin to now reframe certain narratives? And so again, I want to say that this is a heavy topic to cover. And so as I began to think about what I thought that teachers needed in this moment and what would go along with this powerful theme, I thought about this idea of bringing out Black boy joy. I've been doing some work around Black boys at the K through 12 level. And so I wanted to share a little bit of my work through this platform. And so first, a little bit about who I am. So as I said, my name is David Bynes, born and raised in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm a former Broward County Public School student, as well as educator. So I'm one of those went away to college and came back and began to teach in Broward County. My educational background, I have a BA in corporate communications from Elon University. I did my master's at NC State in the area of higher education administration, and I'm currently pursuing my PhD in curriculum and instruction at Florida Atlantic University. As far as my career, I've been in the area of higher education for about 17 years now in various roles, but as an administrator, a practitioner, as well as an instructor. Currently, I serve as the Associate Director for what we call the Center for Inclusion, Diversity, Education, and Advocacy. And so essentially my role there is one as a diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice educator. In addition to that, I'm also a 6-year certified coach, trainer, and speaker, as well as a consultant. And so I'm coming to this platform, again, under the banner of Bynes and Associates Consulting Group. So what do I want to accomplish throughout my time with you? So as I began curating this session, I thought about where I wanted to draw from. And so I'll be drawing from researchers such as Gloria Ladson-Billings, Michael Dumas, Tyrone C. Howard, also Carla Moore. And all of these are educational researchers, right, that have looked at this idea of how we're educating our Black males, looking at this idea of culturally responsive pedagogy or culturally responsive teaching practices, as well as some of them are looking at this idea of Black suffering and anti-Blackness that occurs within schools. I want to pull a little bit from my own work as a PhD student that I began to work on, I recently did a piece on the over-policing of Black bodies, our schools, sites of socialization or suffering. And so in that, I began to argue that schools are beginning to look like these sites where suffering actually happens, according to the body of literature. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move further. And so I'll pull from a little bit from my scholarly work, but I also pull from my own professional career, again, in the area of diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. As I believe that there is a real tie in a lot of this together, as we'll begin to talk about this idea of race and identity and social identity, cultural identity, and how all of this ties together when we begin to talk about and look at how it is that we're educating our Black males. And so essentially in this presentation, my ultimate goal is to engage and expose participants to critical examination and thought about how the education of Black boys can be reimagined to bring out Black boy joy, right? And so our roadmap to reach this destination will cause us to look at a couple of different areas. And so we'll take a look at the current literature on discipline, as well as education of Black boys. We'll also look at this idea of understanding how culturally relevant pedagogy fits into this work, right? As I still believe it's a very critical work at a very critical time. But we'll also begin to examine, what do Black boys need to thrive, right? And then finally, I'll close out the presentation expounding upon the work of Dr. Tyrone and Jaleel Howard, a father and son combination who's doing some powerful work around this radical idea of radical care to Black boys. And so I want to take a look at their work and provide some recommendations for you. And so where do we begin? Well, I like to begin with Paulo Freire, right? One of my favorite scholars. And he says this, he says that there is no such thing as neutral education, and that education either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity or freedom. And so I begin there because I think it's vital that we put some context to where we are, right? In this moment in history, even as we look back upon history, but then as we come forward and we begin to think about where we are and we begin to think about schooling and education, and we begin to think about legislation that is now currently coming forth, I think it's important that we hear and understand Paulo Freire's words here, that education, there is no such thing as a neutral ground. And so as teacher educators, it is important, right, that we begin to choose which side of history that we want to stand on, right? It's this idea that in education, we're going to be the ones that we either are used as an instrument to bring about conformity, right? Stagnation, having history repeat itself, or we're going to be those that are radical in our thinking and critical in our thought process. And we're going to be the ones that take the risk, right? We're going to be the ones that move in what I like to call this liberationist approach, right, toward freedom. And so I want you to think about, what does education mean to you, and really begin to think about, why is it that you became a teacher in the first place, right? And so Paulo sets us there, right? And so I want to then take a critical look at some of the literature. And I term this How Black Boys Experience School. So as I began to dig into the literature, I started thinking about this question: how do Black boys experience school? Because I believe that they experience school a lot different than some of the other demographics, right? And so let's take a look. First of all, we understand that Black boys are seen as a problem in a space that should be safe, and that place is schools, right? So this idea that even for Black boys, right, coming to a place where they should be safe, oftentimes it's not a safe space for them. And again, we'll begin to pull out some of those things that Black boys experience specifically in school, in the space of school. Blatt and Mitchell in 2018, in a piece in 2018, declared this. They said that after years of public concern and emphasis on reducing exclusionary discipline and zero tolerance practices, that Black boys still make up approximately 25% of all students suspended out of school at least once in 2015 and 2016 academic year, right? And so I know that some of this won't be anything new to some of you, but again, I want us to begin to take a look and really begin to take this in as we think about and walk down this journey about how do we begin to bring out Black boy joy, right? And more than that, how do we begin to utilize this idea of radical care, right? What is it? And again, we'll begin to talk about that. Many teachers may not explicitly connect their disciplinary reactions to negative perceptions of Black males, yet systematic trends and disproportionality suggest that teachers may be implicitly guided by stereotypical perceptions that African-American boys require, get this, greater control than their peers and are unlikely to respond to non-punitive measures. And so we're still in this space, right? This was written back in 2005, right, by Dr. Carla Monroe. And so we know that we're still in this space wherein that Black boys are challenged in how they're seen in the classroom and are still being judged, if you will, right, by stereotypical perceptions, right, of what's heard in the media, right? And so we've not necessarily come to a space where we begin to see Black boys for who they are, but we're still stuck in a space where we're looking and sometimes guided by stereotypical perceptions and assumptions. We still believe that Black boys need greater control, right? And that we need to police them and surveil them, and that they don't respond to non-punitive measures. And so we find ourselves in this space of punitive, providing punitive, and I like to call it punitive damage, right? Because we sometimes don't understand what we're doing to the spirit, right? And I love this idea by Dr. Bettina Love, who talks about this idea of spirit murder, right? And how we're often murdering the spirits of our young people. And again, most times not even realizing what we're doing. And so I want us again to begin to take a critical look at this. Dr. David J. Knight, in a piece that he called Beyond the Stereotypical Image of Young Men, began to talk about this, how, again, Black boys are being perceived as a threat, right? And that the immediate response is that they need to be controlled, right? And their bodies need to be policed. And so again, this idea of policing and surveillance, always having this idea of what he calls the white gaze. And I love this piece, right? This idea that the white gaze, he says, is so evident, right, in our public institutions, where Black and brown males are all too often accused of transgression and subject to disciplinary measures. The white gaze is often synonymous with policing or surveilling the body. And so we know that historically, right, that for the Black male and Black people in general, that traditionally our bodies were not our own. Our bodies were owned for such a long time. And so we're still in this space now where even Black boys and Black girls are being made to feel like that their bodies are not their own, that someone else is policing and surveilling to keep alive this idea of white dominance. And I know that's a heavy word, right? And so, and understand that when I will use several different terms, right? And so for me, white dominance is not necessarily akin to white people, but white dominance is a system, right? It's a product of a system, right? And so this idea of even white supremacy, if you will, is a system not necessarily relegated to a particular demographic of people. Dumas is one of my favorite scholars because he begins to dig deep and begins to talk about this idea of the Black body's suffering, right? And begins to talk about even the anti-blackness that exists within school systems. And so in 2016, he wrote an article and he contended that deeply and inextricably embedded within racialized policy discourses is not merely a general and generalizable concern about disproportionality or inequality, but also fundamentally and quite specifically a concern with Black bodies or Black people, right? And the significance of their Blackness and the threat posed by the Black body to the educational well-being of other students. And so here again, we're seeing this data that's coming out and informing this work that suggests that there's this concern about the Black body, right, and Black students and what they do or the threat that they pose to the educational well-being of other students. And so in a little bit, we'll talk about, well, what about their own well-being, right? And we'll begin to understand that a lot of this is coming out of misguided perception, okay? And then Black boys or Black students, particularly Black boys, experience a disconnection, right, with authority figures in the classroom, right? And the K-12 teaching profession is dominated by white women, many of whom are very qualified and very interested in helping all of their students succeed, but lack the firsthand experience, right? And sometimes the firsthand knowledge needed to connect with their Black male students, right? And so this is coming out of an article by Lynch in 2015. And he makes a couple of critical points that I, again, thought was necessary to set the foundational context for our time together, right? Another thing that Lynch says is that in the US Department of Education report found that in schools with at least 50% of Black students, only 48% were certified in the subject area, right? So speaking of teachers, so this is the idea that Black boys don't necessarily attend schools all the time, where those schools are able to have resources that make it capable of educating them properly, right? And so Lynch begins to pull out these statistics, right, around teachers and their certifications, and the issue that where we see a large percentage of Black students, we often find a large percentage of teacher educators that are not certified in their respective areas that they're teaching. And then finally, Black boys are more likely than any other group to be placed in special education classes, with 80% of all special education students being Black or Hispanic males. Again, this is what the literature now begins to tell us, right? And so as we begin to look at this body of work, again, I think it's critical that we use it to set the foundation, because this makes it clear for me that we're in a space, some people will say we've been in this space, right? Where we now need to really begin to look at what I like to call, how do we bring out, what is it that we need to be doing to bring out the Black boy joy, right? And so I want to argue that we can really use this concept that we're going to take a look at that's being developed by the work of Doctors Tyrone and Jaleel Howard to begin to look at it, right? So I think that when we begin to look at this and where do we start, number one, I believe we've got to confront our history, right? And so in this idea, again, of what we see coming down from the various state courts, right, around critical race theory and the 1619 Project, and the idea of rejecting those principles and stopping those ideals and the context of our history from a critical perspective being taught in schools, I think is very damaging, right? Very damaging. And so this particular quote and I found this from a showcasing at a film festival, but it is showcasing a film called Black Boys, right? A documentary that highlights, again, this understanding of what is happening. It begins to track what is happening to our Black boys, right, through education and as they're not being educated, right? And many of them opting to drop out of the school system and what begins to happen to them then. And so a very powerful documentary that I've had the opportunity to look at. And so I pulled this piece because I thought it was very powerful in terms of confronting our history. And it begins to, and it says that we can't reimagine, right? And we have to get this. We can't reimagine school without addressing systematic, right, or systemic racism built into, right, the collective thinking and the policies that have shaped our schools. By confronting our history and acknowledging how it is has shaped our present, we can begin dismantling systemic racism and realize the equitable future for education we have always strived for. And so this is in direct contradiction to what we're seeing, right? That there are certain people who are now saying that we don't need to talk about the systemic racism, right? Saying that critical race theory, right, creates this dynamic where students begin to are taught to hate themselves. I completely disagree with that, right? And so I believe that confronting our history is critical to the reimagination of school and certainly critical to the reimagination of education. When we begin to think about what it is that we can do, how can we begin to reimagine truly how we educate our all of our students, and particularly Black boys? We have to now begin to look at this idea of systemic racism, because historically it's been racism and other areas that has put up major roadblocks, if you will, right? That has allowed the education of Black boys to be halted or to be stagnated. I think it's been systemic racism. And if you want, we could also talk this from a realm of unconscious or implicit bias, right? It's those stereotypes and perceptions, not always from a place of malice, right? But sometimes it's just there, and our teacher educators don't know that they're there, don't realize as they're operating from a frame of their own socialization. But nevertheless, these are the things that has been major roadblocks for successfully educating a lot of our young Black males. And so then Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, again, her seminal work back in the early 90s, she begins and she developed this idea of culturally relevant pedagogy. And I bring this up because I think that we need to revisit this. I think this is a very critical theory that we need to examine, and not just to understand it, but then are we really practicing this idea of critical relevant pedagogy, right? These 5 stages, right? Are we looking at, in terms of our curriculum and instructional material, developing instructional material, are we building in instruction and instructional resources that look at the activities which are relevant to the students' lives, right? Are we really moving in the direction where we're becoming more in relationship, right? And taking the intentional time to build strong relationships with students and with parents that are being involved, right? Are we setting high expectations for all of our students? And again, and particularly Black boys. We'll see in a minute that that's one of the critical areas, particularly for Black boys, right? And so this idea of critical or culturally relevant pedagogy, we begin to understand that it's more than student achievement, but it's also about this idea of the acceptance and the affirmation of their culture, of students' cultural identity, while developing critical perspectives that challenge inequities that schools and other institutions perpetuate. In other words, this gets to the heart of education and not just schooling. This is now teaching our students how to be critical thinkers and to begin to critique, right, the world they live in, and better yet, critique their own worldview. We begin to understand probably somewhere around the age of 9 to 13 that students, and particularly Black males, are already thinking about their worldview. They're thinking about this idea of who am I? They're thinking about how do I fit into the larger society? Many of them have been thrust into roles where they've had to, quote unquote, grow up early. And so we begin to also then see that in a lot of cases that what we call adultification becomes an issue, being that Black boys can't grow up and be boys. And so I would submit to you that if we're going to reimagine education, then that must also start with reimagining childhood, right? We must begin to once again look at this idea of Black boys being boys and not seeing Black boys being older than what they are. And so we set these high expectations, right? This idea of authentic assessment techniques. And so how are we assessing our students, right? That is critical to them, right? That is in a compassionate and empathetic way, right? And then what are the outcomes that we're setting, right? And so outcomes-based teaching. Are we looking at Black boys for who they are and setting expectations and outcomes based on that? Or are we looking at them in general, right? In reference to other students and other demographics? Or are we taking the time to now begin to look at what the literature says, what the statistics say, and now beginning to critically examine how do we now begin to educate Black boys? This idea of being responsive to critical learning styles, again, because we'll see that Black boys, particularly when it comes to curriculum development, we have to consider Black boys, right? Because their learning styles are different, right? And I would even submit a little further that this is true for both Black and brown students, and particularly Black and brown males, right? And so this idea of cultural relevant pedagogy that Dr. Latson Billings coined becomes really critical in this idea of reimagining schools. And again, I know that it's been out there. My question would be, how relevant is it in our schools, right? And so I'd like for those that are listening in on this, that would take some time and really put some critical thought to where does critical relevant pedagogy fit into your practice, right? How does it fit into your practice? And if you find that it may not be there, I would invite you to take a minute and take a pause and begin to go back and look at this and engage this theory once again. Right? So I want to pivot a little bit and begin to talk about what do Black boys need to thrive? Again, if we're going to begin to talk about reimagining school, and if we're going to talk about this from a frame of, once again, now embedding this idea of Black history, I think it's a great space to be in, but it's also a space that we have to clearly understand where it is that we're going, right? And so for me, that starts with examining what do Black boys actually need to thrive, all right? So number one, I would submit to you, again, as we just talked about, Black boys need culturally sustained teaching rooted in anti-racism, right? And we'll talk in just a minute about this idea of radical care, and that you'll see that one of the pieces of radical care is addressing racism as it comes up. And in order to do that, then we need educators who are rooted, right, in and trained in anti-racism, who can be able to respond to it, who can now begin to look at the root of the problem and can engage that problem from an anti-racist perspective. Secondly, we need high expectations that are tied to what is known as warm, demanding, and empathetic approach, right? So this idea of high expectations, but we also want to be compassionate. We also want to be understanding. But understand, Black boys need to be challenged, right? Black males need to be challenged. They need to feel like they're being challenged, or they check out. And so many of you probably have examined that. I remember when my years of teaching middle school, and for me, I quickly realized that it wasn't enough just to be a Black male in the classroom. But I had to now begin to develop an understanding for setting high expectations for students. I taught in an inner city school, and so probably 80 to 90% of our students were from the inner or urban cities. And so quickly I began to understand this need for setting high expectations, oftentimes because no one else in their life had done that before. And so, but at the same time, the approach to setting those high expectations, right, had to be with empathy, because they were coming into a situation where they wanted to learn, they wanted to achieve, but it took some practice and some capacity building for them to be able to get to that point. And so this idea of setting high expectations certainly also has to come with this idea of how you demand it, right? And how it comes out, right? Thirdly, I would suggest to you that Black boys need to be recognized or have their promise and their potential recognized, right? And so this idea that we're looking at them for who they are, we are constantly reaffirming, right, their promise and their destiny. We're also looking at their potential, and we're highlighting those areas of their potential. Again, I think for me, this ties in with the expectations, right? And so as I look at potential, I tie it back to setting high expectations based on that potential. And the articulation of that is always critical to the success of Black boys. Fourthly, for me is this idea that we hold Black boys accountable, again, with this idea of compassion and care. We hold them accountable with compassion and care. We have to begin to take into consideration and understanding what they may be bringing to school, often understanding that home life may be a certain way, understanding that school may or may not be the safest place for them. And so there's a lot of work that's being done. There's a lot that's going on within the mind and the spirit, right, of young Black boys. And so as we hold them accountable, it has to be done with the spirit of compassion and the spirit of care. Again, I go back to this idea and theory that Dr. Bettina Love brings forth in this idea that sometimes what is actually happening within the classroom is murdering the spirits of young Black boys, right? And so before they can even get going good in life, their spirit, right, is already being killed and murdered, to the point now that they shut down, to the point that they began not to try, and they begin to turn to other aspirations, if you will, right? All because they're starting to see themselves as a deficit. One of the things that we have to begin to really take a critical look at is this idea of the deficit-based narrative. Again, nothing new, right? But I challenge and I often wonder, are we critically looking at deficit-based narratives? And then if we are, my question becomes, what are we doing, right, to begin to look at these young Black boys from a space of asset? I talk to my students at the university that I work at a lot about asset, right? And that they are an asset. And it's critical that we begin to address and start from that space of asset versus deficit. Again, this idea of looking at them, right, for all that they are, and continuing to reinforce the ideas that they have promise and that they have potential as we hold them accountable. Black boys need positive and strong relationships built upon the anti-banking model, right? This idea, the anti-banking model, is the idea brought forth by Paulo Freire, right? And so this idea that, it's not just a one-sided relationship, but it's mutual, right? And so positive, strong relationships, mutual in nature, because you'll find that Black boys have this strong need to be heard, right? They have a strong need to be able to articulate themselves and know that through genuine care, that there's someone on the other end of that relationship wanting to listen to them and hear them out. And so positive and strong relationships built on the anti-banking model are needed to help Black boys thrive. Black boys also need for curriculum and instructional practices that motivate and empower them to actively learn, right? It's in this space. And so how we carefully curate or craft our curriculum and the instructional practices and material that we bring in do matter, right? And Black boys need that to thrive. They need to understand the idea of participating, right, in the classroom setting. What is it that's going to draw them in, right? Well, it's going to be things that pay attention to their life, things that allow them to talk about their experiences, things that allow them to engage based on who they or their most authentic self, right? It's going to be things, as we talk about this idea of Black boy joy, those things that cause them joy. And so this requires that we get to know each and every student within our classrooms, right, that we teach. So curriculum and instructional practices are a critical thing when it comes to looking at how Black boys or what Black boys need to thrive. They also need this idea of anti-deficit reframing, right? So I talked about reframing a little bit earlier, but this idea of anti-deficit reframing, watch that, instills resilience and provides restoration, right? So instills this idea of strength, right? And really highlights this idea because it's there. You will find that most people, Black and brown people, bring to the table this idea of what I call built-in resilience, right? Because of the historical narrative and the historical landscape, the historical terrain that they've had to conquer. Even young boys, right? The terrain that they've had to conquer most days just to show up, right? Takes resilience. And so we begin to look at this idea of resiliency and this idea of what am I doing as a teacher educator to begin to restore, right? What am I pouring back into them from a space of curriculum and instruction that begins to restore what they've lost and what they've given up? Again, this takes the idea of learning about them and learning about their environments. We will quickly begin to realize that for Black boys, right, in the K through 12 system in particular, and really K through 20, we begin to see this idea that they've lost so much over their short young life that now when they come to spaces of education, there's this need for restoration and healing. And this is why teacher educators and others, when we talk about teacher educators or leaders or administrators, this is that need that we now begin to help restore all that they've been forced to give up, right? And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in coming minutes. And then finally, this thought about what Black boys need to thrive, for me, centers around African-centered education. And I know that this is a heavy one because everyone is not into the practice of African-centered education. African-centered education doesn't necessarily or is not necessarily a requirement for culturally relevant or culturally sustained teaching, but I would argue that it needs to be and that it should be, right? And I also understand that not everyone is educated upon this particular principle. But again, in terms of how Black boys thrive, the data suggests that African-centered education is one of those ways. That when Black boys are reintroduced to African principles, whether it's the principles of Kwanzaa, right? Whether it's principles of healing, whether it's principles of what I call principles of ancestry, right? And learning how it is that they approach and that they engage elders in the community. This idea of African-centered education is a strong space of critical work that now helps Black boys thrive. And so I would suggest to any teacher, educator, administrators to begin to look at some of the critical theorists, if you will, whose work is centered around African-centered education. One of my favorites is Aisha Hilliard, right? I am also into Black psychology. I believe as I bring that into my work in my mentoring roles that I do with young boys, as well as the roles that I have with young Black men at the university level, I am finding more and more that the idea of reintroducing them to African-centered education, African-centered principles does a lot to begin to build up their self-esteem. It does a lot to instill that resilience, and it also does a lot to provide that restoration that I talked about in the previous point. And so these are things that Black boys need to thrive, right? That for me, I've seen in my own work, I've also seen in the literature. And so again, as we're thinking about reimagining education, we want to pause and we want to begin to take a critical examination of these points of what help Black boys thrive. And we want to make sure that we're looking at our own pedagogy, right? Our own teaching practices, and to really critically examine them and see whether or not these things exist. Right? And so I want to move into now looking at Howard's work. Again, the work being done by a father and son combination of Doctors Tyrone Howard and Jaleel Howard. And so I pulled these from an article the work that they're doing that they released in 2021 and kind of expounded and expanded on them. But I want to go through them a couple of points with you, again, to help understand where it is and how you can begin to show radical care to the students that are in your care, right? And so point number one, interrogate your preconceived notions, right? And so what does that mean? We got to understand that, this idea of, again, these assumptions and stereotypes, right? Because we all have assumptions, right? We all have bias. And so the point becomes, what work am I doing, right? And so the question for me is, what is the first image that comes into your mind when you think about Black boys? We'll pause there for just a second. All right. What's that first image that comes into your mind when you think about Black boys? Is it a positive image of seeing Black boys in their space of joy, their space of achievement? Or is it a negative thought that we've often gotten from the media, right? Often gotten from data that's been published. But it begins to come out of that space of our own bias. And so we have to take a critical look and ask ourselves, what is the first image that comes to mind when I think about Black boys. And then this idea of reimagining education for Black boys requires reimagining childhood, right? We have to go back and begin to ask critical questions about childhood. What has their childhood been like? Do we understand what Black boys are bringing even to the classroom? Do we understand what is, so to speak, upon their shoulders? What are their thoughts? What are their feelings that they are grappling with, right, on a day-to-day basis? And so before we can even begin to reimagine education, I believe we have to also then begin to reimagine childhood, right? In other words, allowing children to be children. As we know, in many cases, Black boys are not allowed, right, to be a child. They have to grow up fast. And this has been a historical context for Black boys. Recognize that Black boys experience wonder, experience and give joy, love, and happiness. Again, sometimes these things are overlooked, right? Based upon those assumptions that we might have, based upon this thought or this feeling of need to surveil or police young Black boys. And as we do that, sometimes we forget that they're just like every other student in the room, in the school. And so we have to begin to recognize that they too experience wonder and excitement and have this drive for adventure and are curious, right? And are complex. And so we have to begin to understand that, and we cannot overlook this fact, again, which data suggests is often done, right? In the classroom, that Black boys, their ability to be curious and complex, their ability to be adventurous, their ability to be smart and articulate are often overshadowed by disproportionality practices and measures. Often overshadowed by our own preconceived notions. And so we have to begin to interrogate those, right? There's data that suggests that this has to come through the work, right? Number one, the work starts with you. And it's an internal work. It's not a cognitive work necessarily, but it's a both and for me, meaning it's cognitive work, but it's also heart work. I usually call that, the head and heart work, right? Because the head and heart have to be connected. And so this is that work, that internal work, internalized work that we really have to begin to do as we interrogate our own preconceived notions about Black boys. Second way to show radical care, excuse me, is to create a classroom culture inclusive of Black boys. What does that mean? That means that we're taking a critical look at our classroom ecology, the classroom environment. We're paying attention to that, and we're making sure, being very intentional, that the classroom culture is set up in such a way, structured in such a way, that it allows Black boys to see themselves as an asset, right? We recognize that this is from a space or a frame where it also recognizes the humanity of Black boys, and that this also, and how the classroom culture is managed, also then begins to suggest who belongs and who matters. And it's important, it's critical, it's vital for Black boys to understand that they belong and that they matter. But then this last point is that we should be inclusive, but we also have to be careful not to tokenize, right? And so sometimes in trying to develop relationships, sometimes in trying to help Black boys understand that they do matter, right? Rather than having genuine, authentic relationship, rather than authentically challenging them to be the best that they can be, sometimes inclusivity also comes with tokenism. And so we have to make sure that we're not tokenizing Black boys. that they are being challenged just like every other student in the room, but they are also getting the same equity that every student in the room is afforded. So creating a classroom culture inclusive of Black boys is critical to showing radical care. A third point in terms of showing radical care would be this idea, addressing racism when it surfaces, right? Why is this critical? This is critical not only because racism is wrong, not only because racism is harmful, right, to everybody, but this idea that racism addressing racism is critical because for Black boys, they already show up suspicious, right? Black boys already show up most times not believing that they're in a safe place or safe space, right? And so there are times that they just don't feel seen, they don't feel understood, they don't feel heard, oftentimes they don't feel protected. And so addressing racism when it surfaces is critical. As some would say, nipping it in the bud is critical, right? Because it's critical to the success of Black boys, right? Because they've often dealt with these subtle and sometimes blatant forms of racism, right? They're dealing with microaggressions on a daily basis, right? They're dealing sometimes with lowered expectation, right? Again, as we talked about, they're also dealing with this idea of being surveilled, right? Or, and rightly, and in this space, we have to begin to say unsubstantiated surveillance, right? Unfair discipline practices. The data shows it, right? And in some cases, it's very overt anti-blackness that Black boys begin to experience. And so addressing racism when it surfaces is critical to showing self-care. Because going back, this idea of radical self-care, or this radical idea of radical care to Black boys, which suggests to them, right, that they matter and that they belong. It goes a long way in developing a strong relationship and strong bond. Be mindful of depictions of Black males, right? And so as we talk about this, again, this idea of how to show radical care, we have to be mindful of the depiction of Black males. Why is this the case? We got to understand that Black boys have to be considered, right, in curriculum development in order to ensure instructional material don't reinforce negative stereotypes and ideologies. So it's critical in terms of representation, because Black boys have to be able to see themselves in proper context, according to who they are. I would also suggest that not being mindful of how Black males are represented in the classroom can send devaluing and dehumanizing messages, but it also begins to reinforce ideas of Black inferiority. And so we have to now begin to take heed to how we're portraying and depicting the Black male, even in the classroom. And then finally, on this point, I would say that in terms of curriculum materials, should recognize and affirm the diversity that exists among Black boys and men. In other words, we have to now show them the full gamut of who Black boys and Black men have the capacity to be. We want to begin to engage young Black boys in this idea of the affirmation through diversity, through inclusion, through certainly equity. And we want to show them the full range of what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a male, and what it means to move into manhood, right? And when we're dealing with Black boys, this is critical. And it's critical because it now begins to help foster this idea of healthy masculinity, right? And so it's critical that we begin to look at, again, in the purpose of the classroom, right, context of the classroom, right? When we're talking about classroom ecology, when we're talking about classroom rules and classroom management, classroom behavior, and even to the curriculum materials, we want to make sure that we are recognizing and affirming a full range of diversity for Black boys so that they can begin to look at how they're becoming, right? I often talk about this idea of to be and become, this idea that we're always being, but yet we're always evolving. And so Black boys are always evolving. And so it's critical that we begin to look at who are they becoming. It's critical that we help them to begin to understand who they are becoming, right? And all of that has its foundation in how they begin to see Black males depicted, because they also then begin to see themselves. Another point here would be to talk with Black boys about their experiences, right? Talk to Black boys about their experiences. They want to be heard. They want to have open discussion. They want to be able to express themselves and articulate themselves. And this is a critical piece in terms of talking with Black boys about the experience, because we have to remember that approximately only 2% of teachers in the United States are Black men, right? And so we have to begin to understand that an overwhelmingly majority of teachers are white women. Again, very capable educators, but we have to also begin to understand that as it relates to Black boys, that they relate to Black men or people that look like them more often than not. And so working to build and sustain relationships with Black boys is vital to success. But it also takes realizing and being open and honest and very intentional about who I am as a teacher educator. And so while I'm trying to build relationship and I'm trying to talk about experience, it doesn't require me to stretch beyond, right, who I really am. Yes, it requires me to attain the necessary knowledge, right? It requires me to put in the necessary work. And as I now begin to develop certain principles and certain practices, but I still want to be my most authentic self, because authenticity and genuineness goes a long way in terms of building relationships with Black boys, right? And so build the capacity and the courage to ask, right? What you don't know, you have to be willing to ask, right? Because this is a direct tie into this point about meaningful discourse, right? So learning how to ask the right question the right way opens up way for meaningful discourse, which then begins to strengthen the relationship and the bond between teacher and student, right? And that student begins now to see you as a possibility of being in his world, right? And that's a direct lead into this next point, which is to show interest in their community. Showing interest in community, again, goes a long way in building relationships. And so showing a genuine, knowledgeable interest in their community opens and demonstrates care. It begins to openly demonstrate care. They now begin to see you as one that genuinely care about who they are, right? This idea means understanding lived experiences of Black boys, but not consuming to pop culture. Again, you have to remain your most authentic self while also doing the work that it takes to begin to understand the lived experiences. And oftentimes that's gonna require the asking of a lot of uncomfortable questions, having some uncomfortable dialogue, but also having the courage and the intentionality to do so. You want to ask about upcoming plans. And so this is one of the ways to begin to show that interest, right? Take idea to ask about upcoming plans. And then when those plans have passed, you want to ask about the outcome of those plans. So here you're getting students to open up, Black boys in particular, you're getting them to open up and begin to talk and to begin to have dialogue around what it is that their livelihood is about. And here again, I would say that it's going to take courage to be able to hear, right, some of the narratives that come along this journey, and be prepared, having done your work, to build the capacity to be able to endure, right, the narratives that you're going to begin to absorb. And so you want to ask about their plans, and you want to begin to also investigate how did those plans come? What are the outcomes? So you're getting them to open up and engage. And then a final point here in terms of how to show radical care, right, is this idea of an authentic commitment. It has to be genuine, has to be intentional. And so we want to think about reimagining education of Black boys and creating space that bring out Black joy, right? Well, if we do that, then we got to understand this requires intentional, sincere, and authentic commitment to seeing the absolute best in Black boys, right? And secondly, this idea of radical care for Black boys is a mindset, right? It's not just a simple plan. It's not just something that I can think about, but it's a mindset that I now have to begin to embody. And so this entire process of showing radical care is an embodied process, right, where you begin to engage students, invite them into your world as they invite you into theirs. It's a radical consciousness, right? So this idea of developing around racial consciousness, and we're beginning now to develop racial literacy, right? And so there's some work out there by Dr. Yolanda Seeley Ruiz that talks about this idea of racial literacy development, right? Where you begin to understand that it's rooted in critical love. And so out of that critical love, we also begin to understand that this requires a deep-seated conviction, that you have to be convicted, right? The heart has to be convicted to do this work, because being a teacher educator is more complex than it's probably ever been in these day and time. We also want to understand this idea that there has to be a willingness to create, again, curriculum and instruction and relationship arrangements that include them, not exclude them, right? That understand them, that affirm them, not denounce them, and that challenge them to be their very best, right? And so radical care is an embodied experience. And so as we begin to think about reimagining school, reimagining education for Black boys, we also then have to understand what it means to show radical care. Because it's through that showing of radical care that we begin to empower Black boys. It's through radical care that we validate their experiences. It's through this idea of radical care that we also affirm Black boys. We affirm them in their identity and who they are and who they are becoming. It's through this practice of radical care that we also help them build resilience and confidence. And it's through this idea of radical care that for Black boys, that we are helping them to attach themselves, and that we are drawing them into this process of that we call schooling. It's through this process of practice, through these pieces of education, the context of education, that we are now inviting our young Black boys to have a greater connection to schooling. because they're finally now starting to see school as a safe space. I would also say that they're beginning to see school as a liberating space, right? And so radical care begins to show forth this idea of liberation, that we're showing radical care because we're trying to help Black boys understand the process of liberating themselves. So, just a closing thought here from a piece of the work that I've done. And it's this idea around what are we seeing, right, in the classroom, right? What are we seeing through the education of Black boys? What are Black boys, again, experiencing? How are they seeing school? How do they experience school? And so this closing thought for me is just understanding that there is hope, right? There is hope because there's growing evidence that suggests that school inequities involving Black or African Americans are addressed best through race-based initiatives. And we have to understand, we have to believe that, right? That we have to continue to challenge folks, not make people feel guilty or shame for who they are or the color of their skin, but we're simply looking at through the context of praxis, that now we know that we get best results through this idea of race-based initiatives, that we're beginning, because it's through the race-based initiatives that we're dealing with identity, right? This idea of helping young Black boys begin to figure out who they really are as Black boys, who will become Black males and Black teenagers, and who will become Black men. And so this is a communal approach, right? Through intentional practitioner preparation and development. And so we have to be prepared for this work. We're no longer in a space where we can afford, right, a lack of preparation. If we're truly serious about closing the education deficit, right, or the achievement deficit, some may still call it the achievement gap. Latson Billings calls it a deficit. And she began to look at the history, right, of where we're coming from and all that we're dealing with, all that has been lost. Now we're dealing with a deficit. And so that deficit, in order for that deficit to be overcome or that gap to be closed, is going to take intentional practitioner preparation and development, right? Providing opportunities for education practitioners to assess their own racialized attitudes and beliefs about specific student populations and to develop skills centered on culturally responsive elements and expectations concerning discipline present potentiality to shift disproportionality and change the landscape of school systems across the United States. What am I saying? That when we're prepared, when we care, when we function through culturally relevant pedagogy and teacher practices, when we take time to intentionally develop our skill, right? We really put in the work in our professional development, whether that's through our institutions or it's on our own, but we're now developing our skill set because we want to now be in a space where we are assisting young Black boys with bringing out Black boy joy, right? And we're believing that Black boy joy can come out or be exposed by using radical care. Those principles that we just talked about of radical care. We've come to the end of our segment. I truly hope that you've been able to gain some knowledge that you may not have had. or maybe this was a refresher for you. And so again, I am grateful to share upon this platform. And I look forward to further engagement with you all. Thank you so much.